It began with an unrelenting blizzard, the kind that devoured the sky and buried the world in a suffocating shroud of white. The villagers of Frosthaven had long feared winters like these, for they carried whispers of disappearances, of lost souls who wandered into the woods and were never seen again. It was said that the snowstorm wasn't natural, that it came alive with the cries of the forgotten, and that those who dared tread too far would be claimed by the shadows beneath the snow. I came to Frosthaven out of curiosity, a historian with a penchant for the macabre, eager to document the folklore of remote villages before it vanished in the face of modernity. The storm was already brewing when I arrived, the icy wind biting through my coat as I trudged through the narrow, winding streets. The houses stood like ancient sentinels, their warped wood and frosted windows giving the village a hollow, desolate air. Even the locals seemed ghostly, their gaunt faces and sunken eyes peering out from heavy scarves and hoods. The innkeeper was reluctant to rent me a room, but a few coins loosened her tongue. As she handed me a key, she warned, "Don't wander at night. The woods aren't kind to strangers." Her tone was cold, her eyes flickering with something unspoken, but I dismissed it as rural superstition. I had heard similar warnings in countless villages, each one convinced their corner of the world was cursed. That night, as the storm raged outside, I sat by the inn's fire, flipping through my notes. The stories I'd gathered so far painted a chilling picture. Children vanishing into the forest, drawn by ghostly laughter. Hunters found frozen solid, their expressions twisted in terror, and whispers of shadowy figures that moved just beyond the tree line. The common thread in every tale was the woods, always the wood. As the hours passed, the inn grew silent, the other patrons retreating to their rooms. I was alone, save for the crackling fire and the moan of the wind outside. Just as I was preparing to retire, I heard it, a faint knock at the window. Startled, I turned, but the frosted glass revealed nothing. Assuming it was a branch blown by the wind, I returned to my work, only for the knock to come again, louder this time. I rose, heart pounding, and approached the window. The snow outside was so thick I could barely see beyond the glass, but as I leaned closer, I noticed something that made my breath catch, a series of tiny handprints pressed into the frost. They were too small to belong to an adult, and they hadn't been there moments ago. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, but I told myself it was a prank, perhaps some mischievous child braving the storm. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. I returned to my seat. Sleep eluded me that night. The wind howled with an almost human quality, and every creak of the inn felt like footsteps on the floor above. When dawn finally broke, I ventured into the village to ask about the handprints. The locals were tight-lipped, their gazes avoiding mine, as if speaking of it might summon some. Finally, a frail elderly woman took pity on me and whispered, "The children, they call to the lonely, the curious, the foolish. If you hear them, it's already too." Despite her warning, I felt compelled to investigate. I couldn't leave without understanding the truth behind the legend. That evening, armed with nothing but a lantern and my notebook, I ventured into the woods. The storm had eased, but the air was deathly cold, and the trees loomed like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. I walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each step. The deeper I went, the more the silence unnerved me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, but a heavy, suffocating absence of sound, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, just as I was considering turning back, I heard it, a soft giggle, high-pitched and playful, like a child's laugh. My blood ran cold. The sound came from deeper in the woods, faint yet distinct. Against all logic, I followed it, my lantern casting flickering shadows on the snow. The laughter grew louder, interspersed with whispers I couldn't quite make out. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches forming a twisted tunnel. And then I saw them. At first, they looked like children, small figures darting between the trees, their movements too quick and fluid to be natural. Their laughter echoed around me, light and innocent yet deeply unsettling. As one of them stepped into the light of my lantern, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't a child at all. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with empty sockets where eyes should have been. Frost clung to its skin, and its grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth like shards of ice. I stumbled back, dropping my notebook, but the creatures didn't move closer. Instead, they began to chant, their voices overlapping in a discordant melody. The snow beneath me shifted, and I felt an icy grip around my ankle. Looking down, I saw skeletal hands clawing their way out of the snow, pulling me downward. I screamed, thrashing against the hands, but the more I struggled, the deeper I sank. The children, or whatever they were, watched silently, their grins unchanging. Just as the snow reached my chest, I grabbed the lantern and swung it wildly, the flame flaring as it struck one of the creatures. It let out an ear-piercing shriek, and the others scattered, their forms dissolving into the shadows. Freed from their gaze, the hands released me, and I scrambled to my feet, running blindly through the woods. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the snow-covered ground. When I looked back, the trees stood silent and unmoving, as though nothing had happened. I left Frosthaven the next morning, my notebook abandoned in the woods. To this day, I can still hear their laughter in my dream, and sometimes, on cold winter nights, I wake to find tiny handprints on my bedroom window. It began with a dinner invitation, hand-delivered to my doorstep on a snowy winter evening. The envelope was an antique parchment sealed with red wax, the handwriting elegant yet unfamiliar. The letter was addressed to me by name, though I couldn't recall meeting anyone in the secluded village who would extend such an invitation. You are cordially invited to dine at Blackthorn Manor, a celebration of the winter solstice. Dress warmly, arrive at 8. The name Blackthorn Manor sent a shiver through. Locals spoke of it only in hushed tones, their eyes darting away when pressed for details. It sat on the edge of the village, a looming shadow against the horizon, abandoned, or so I thought. Curiosity got the better of me, as it always did, and I decided to go. Perhaps the mystery of the host would reveal more of the secrets that the villagers seemed determined to hide. The path to Blackthorn Manor was treacherous, the snow waist-deep and the cold biting through my coat. The journey felt far longer than it should have been, the moonlight barely illuminating the narrow path. When the manor finally came into view, its imposing presence stopped my tracks. The structure was vast and ancient, its towering spires clawing at the night sky. Warm, golden light spilled from the windows, promising comfort despite the bitter cold. The heavy oak doors opened before I could knock, revealing a tall man in a black suit. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his deep-set eyes regarded me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You are expected," he said in a voice as cold as the air outside. He didn't ask for my name, nor did he seem surprised by my arrival. Inside, the warmth of the manor was immediate and overwhelming. The grand hall was lit by dozens of chandeliers, their candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. A roaring fire burned in a massive stone hearth, and the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine filled the air. Several guests were already gathered, their laughter echoing faintly through the hall. They were dressed in formal, old-fashioned attire that looked decades, if not centuries, out of place. I tried to introduce myself, but the other guests barely acknowledged me. Their faces seemed blurred, as though I couldn't focus on their features. Whenever I looked away, I would forget their faces entirely. The only one who seemed to notice my unease was a woman standing near the fire. She was stunning, with raven black hair and a blood-red gown. Unlike the others, her face was clear, her piercing green eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly as I approached. "I was invited," I replied, holding up the letter. Her expression darkened. "They always invite one like you. The rest of us, we're not guests, we're the feast." Before I could ask what she meant, the tall man who had greeted me announced that dinner was served. The guests filed into the dining hall, and I found myself swept along with them. The table was a lavish display of decadence. Silver platters piled high with steaming meats, bowls of vibrant fruits, and glasses of dark, rich wine. I hesitated, the woman's warning echoing in my mind, but the scent of the food was intoxicating. As the meal began, the guests' laughter grew louder, their movements more frenzied. They tore into the food with an animalistic hunger, their once blurred faces growing sharper, more grotesque. Their eyes glinted with an unnatural light, and their laughter took on a sinister edge. I barely touched my plate, my appetite soured by the growing unease in my chest. The woman in red caught my gaze from across the table, shaking her head subtly. I pushed my chair back, intending to leave, but the tall man appeared at my side, his skeletal hand resting heavily on my shoulder. "You haven't tasted the roast yet," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, I picked up my fork and knife, cutting into the meat. The texture was strange, the aroma sickly sweet. As I lifted the piece to my mouth, a flash of crimson caught my eye. The roast on my plate wasn't meat, it was flesh, charred and glistening with blood. I dropped the fork, the clatter drawing the attention of the other guests. Their faces turned toward me in unison, their eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. The tall man smiled, his teeth sharp and unnaturally white. "You're the last course," he said softly. Panic surged through me, and I bolted from the table. The guests rose as one, their movements jerky and human, their laughter echoing through the hall. I ran blindly, the manor twisting and warping around me. Doors led to empty voids, hallways looped back on themselves, and the walls seemed to close in. Finally, I stumbled into the grand hall, the fire still roaring in the hearth. The woman in red was waiting for me, her expression grim. "There's only one way out," she said, handing me a silver knife. "What do you mean?" I gasped. But before she could answer, the other guests poured into the room, their faces grotesque and melting, their laughter turning to guttural growls. She nodded toward the knife. "End it before they do." I raised the blade, my hands trembling, but before I could make a decision, the guests descended upon me. Their icy hands clawed at my skin, their jagged teeth tearing into my flesh. I screamed, the pain unbearable. But as the world darkened, I saw the woman in red, watching from the corner, her expression one of sorrow and relief. When I woke, I was lying in the snow outside the manor, my clothes torn and bloodied. The building loomed in the distance, dark and silent once more. The invitation was still in my hand, though the words had changed. "We hope you enjoyed your stay. Return anytime." I fled Frosthaven that same day, but I've never truly escaped. On cold winter nights, I can still hear the laughter of the guests, and sometimes I catch a glimpse of the woman in red in my dreams. Her words haunt me still. "The rest of it, we're the feast." The wind howled like a beast in agony, carrying with it an icy chill that gnawed at my bones. I had no choice but to keep walking. My car had skidded off the deserted mountain road hours ago, and the storm showed no signs of easing. The snow came down in relentless sheets, blurring the landscape into an endless white void. With no cell service and night falling fast, I knew my only hope of survival was to find shelter. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a faint light flickering through the snowstorm. It seemed impossibly far, but it was my only chance. I stumbled toward it, my legs heavy with exhaustion, until the shape of a cabin emerged from the storm. It stood alone in the desolation, its weathered wooden frame battered by time and nature. The light came from a single oil lamp in the window, casting an eerie glow that seemed both inviting and foreboding. I knocked on the door, my gloved hand trembling. No answer. Desperation, and I pushed the door open, stepping inside. The warmth was immediate, but the air felt heavy, like stepping into a forgotten crypt. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A wooden table, 2 chairs, and a stone hearth where a fire burned low. The only sign of life was the lamp on the table, its flame wavering in still air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. No response. The cabin appeared abandoned, yet the fire and lamp told a different story. Uneasy, I shut the door against the storm and stood there unsure of what to do. That's when I saw the journal. It sat on the table, its leather cover cracked with age. Something about it drew me in despite the nagging voice in my head, telling me to leave it alone. I sat down, opened the journal, and began to read. The entries were written in a spidery script, the ink faded but legible. The first entry was dated over a century ago. "The storm shows no mercy. The beast roams tonight, its cries echoing through the wood. I have barred the door and prayed for dawn, but I fear it will come for me as it did the others." I froze, my eyes darting to the door. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows as if to emphasize the journal's warning. Forcing myself to read on, I turned the page. The next entry was dated a day later. It came to the cabin last night. The scratching at the door, the low growl. It is no animal of this world. I dared not look, but I felt its eyes upon me. It knows I am here. The words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the storm outside. I looked around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every creak of the wood. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, but it felt insufficient against the growing dread in my chest. Another entry followed. I hear it now, pacing outside. It does not leave tracks in the snow. It is patient, relentless. It feeds on fear. If you are reading this, do not let it in. No matter what it says, no matter what you hear. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As if on cue, a sound came from outside, a soft, deliberate scratching at the door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the wind. It was too precise, too rhythmic. The scratching continued, followed by a low, guttural growl that made my stomach twist. The journal's words echoed in my mind. "Do not let it in." The scratching stopped, replaced by a new sound, a voice. "Help me," it called, weak and trembling. It was a man's voice, desperate and pleading. "Please, I'm lost in the storm. Let me in." I stood, heart pounding, torn between instinct and the warning in the journal. The voice sounded so human, so full of pain, but something about it felt wrong, like a poorly rehearsed performance. My eyes darted to the window, but the frost obscured any view of what lay beyond. "Please," the voice begged again. "It's so cold. I'm going to die out here." I stepped closer to the door, my hand hovering over the latch. My mind raced. What if it really was someone in need? What if I was dooming them to freeze to? But the journal's warning screamed in my head, "No matter what you hear." Before I could decide, the voice changed. It deepened, taking on a guttural, almost animalistic tone. "Let me in," it growled, the words stretching unnaturally. "I know you're in there." The door rattled violently, and I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice began to laugh, a chilling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You can't hide from me," it hissed. "I'll be here when the fire dies." Panicked, I grabbed the journal and flipped through the remaining pages, searching for anything that could help. The final entry stopped me cold. I made the mistake of looking at it. Its eyes are not meant for man. It is no longer at the door because it is already inside. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The cabin was small. There was nowhere to hide, and yet the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in ways they shouldn't. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the firelight, a figure stood. Its form was indistinct, a mass of darkness that seemed to ripple like water. Two pale, luminous eyes stared back at me, their gaze piercing and inhuman. My legs refused to move, my body paralyzed by sheer terror. It didn't lunge at me or speak. It just stood there watching, as if savoring my fear. The journal slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a dull thud, breaking the silence. The figure began to move, its motions jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with its strings cut. I stumbled back, hitting the table and knocking over the lamp. The flame extinguished, plunging the room into darkness, and then I ran. I don't know how I made it out of that cabin. The storm swallowed me whole, the snow blinding and merciless, but I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't think. Somehow I found the road again, flagged down a passing trucker who took one look at my pale face and didn't ask questions. I never went back to that mountain, and I never told anyone what happened. But on cold winter nights, when the wind howls and the snow falls thick, I swear I can still hear it. The scratching at the door, the laughter and those words that will haunt me forever. I'll be here when the fire... The night I lost myself began with a phone call. It was a bitterly cold winter evening, the kind where the frost clung to the windows and every breath fogged up the air. I was alone in my small rented cabin, nestled deep in the woods of Frostville. The isolation suited me, or so I thought. The phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m., startling me from my half-drowsy state by the fire. I didn't recognize the number, but in a town this small, most calls were local. Hesitating for only a moment, I picked up. "Hello?" A crackling silence followed, and then a voice, soft, trembling, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have stayed. It's coming for you." "Who is this?" I asked, my heart racing. The line went dead. I stared at the receiver for a long moment, my mind whirring. It had to be a prank call. The locals weren't exactly welcoming when I first moved here. Maybe this was their way of telling me I didn't belong. I set the phone down and tried to shake off the unease, but the fire in the hearth didn't seem as warm anymore. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, I answered with more irritation than fear. "Whoever this is, it's not funny." The same voice, quieter now. "Don't open the door." A chill ran down my spine. My gaze instinctively shifted to the cabin door. It was locked, bolted from the inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Who is this? What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "They always come for the ones who are alone. Don't listen to it. Don't let it in. Don't look at it." The line went dead again. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. The storm outside had picked up, the wind howling like a banshee, rattling the windows. I checked the locks, reassured myself that I was safe. It was just a prank, I told myself. Someone's twisted idea of fun. But then the knock came. 3 sharp raps, precise and deliberate. I froze. My cabin was isolated, the nearest neighbor miles away. No one should have been out there, not in this storm. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I crept to the window, careful to stay out of sight, and peered through the frost-covered glass. At first, I saw nothing but snow and darkness. Then, a figure emerged, a silhouette standing just beyond the porch light. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. His body was unnaturally still, his head tilted at an odd angle. He didn't move, didn't shiver, despite the bitter cold. "Please," he said, his voice muffled by the storm. "I need help. I'm lost." The voice was wrong. It sounded human, but there was something off about it, a hollow quality that set my teeth on it. I didn't respond. "Please," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. "Let me in. It's so cold." I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. The phone call echoed in my mind. "Don't open the door. Don't let it in." The knocking grew louder, more frantic. "Help me!" the voice cried, now filled with desperation. I backed away from the door, my eyes fixed on it as if it might burst open at any moment. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. Then I heard it, a faint scratching like nails dragging against wood. It moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the edges of the doorframe. I grabbed the fire poker, clutching it tightly as I crept closer to the door. My breath fogged up the air, each exhale trembling with fear. The scratching stopped, a new sound, low and guttural, like a growl rumbling from deep within a throat. It wasn't human. The voice outside changed, becoming distorted, almost mocking. "Please let me in. It's so cold. Don't you want to help me?" I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The thing outside began to laugh, a sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl. "You can't hide forever," it said, its voice now a guttural snarl. "I can smell your fear." I don't remember much after that. At some point, the storm outside grew deafening, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. I must have passed out, clutching the fire poker, because when I woke, the cabin was silent. The fire had died, leaving the room cold and dark. I checked the door. It was still locked, the bolts firmly in place. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness. But when I looked down, I saw them, claw marks etched deep into the wood of the door. As if something had tried to tear its way inside, I packed my things that morning and left Frostvale without looking back. To this day, I don't know what was out there in the storm, but on cold winter nights, when the wind howls and the snow falls thick, I sometimes hear a faint knocking, no matter where I am. 3 sharp raps, precise and deliberate. The night it began, I had just finished settling into my late grandfather's cabin, an inheritance I wasn't sure I wanted. It sat deep in the northern woods, isolated from civilization, and surrounded by an oppressive, almost suffocating silence. Winters here were brutal, with snow blanketing everything like a suffocating shroud. I had come to sort through his belongings, hoping to find closure after his sudden death. The locals said he died of a heart attack, but their whispers hinted at something more sinister. He shouldn't have stayed out here alone, they said, their eyes darting nervously toward the woods. The first few days passed uneventfully. The cabin was cold, its walls lined with faded photographs and dusty books. My grandfather had been a reclusive man, his journals filled with cryptic musings about the woods, a thing he claimed lived there. I dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man who had spent too much time alone. But on the 5th night, as a snowstorm raged outside, I found something I couldn't explain. It started with the whisper. I was sitting by the fire, flipping through one of my grandfather's journals, when I heard them. Soft, indistinct voices carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the storm playing tricks on me, but the longer I listened, the more distinct they became. The voices were coming from the woods. I went to the window, peering into the darkness. The snow fell thick and fast, obscuring everything beyond the immediate yard. But the voices persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Help us," they pleaded, faint but clear. I told myself it was just the wind, that I was imagining, but then I saw them. Figures, barely visible through the storm, moving slowly through the snow. They were indistinct, almost shadow-like, but there was something undeniably human about their shapes. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the bitter cold biting at my skin. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the storm. "Is someone out there?" The figures didn't respond. They continued moving, circling the cabin at a distance, their shapes barely visible through the swirling snow. I stepped off the porch, my boots sinking into the snow, as I aimed the flashlight toward them. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on one of the figures. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a woman, or at least it had been. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes sunken and lifeless. Her mouth hung open as if frozen mid-scream, and her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Help us," her voice echoing unnatural. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The other figures began to move closer, their forms shifting and flickering like images on a broken screen. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, retreating toward the cabin. As I reached the porch, one of the figures lunged toward me. Its hand, if you could call it that, grabbed my arm. The touch was ice cold, and a wave of numbness spread through my body. I screamed, yanking my arm free and slamming the cabin door shut behind me. Inside, I locked the door and bolted every window. My arm throbbed where the figure had touched me, the skin pale and frostbitten. The whispers grew louder, filling the cabin with their maddening chorus. "They won't let you go," a voice said, startling me. I spun around and saw him, my grandfather, or at least his ghostly form. He stood by the fireplace, his face gaunt and eyes filled with sorrow. "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "They're the lost ones," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Souls trapped by the woods. They come for the living, hoping to drag them into the darkness." "What do they want from me?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "To take you," he said simply. "Like they took me." I backed away, shaking my head. No, this can't be real." But it was. The walls of the cabin began to creak, the temperature plummeting until my breath fogged in the air. The whispers turned to screams, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to move, writhing and twisting into grotesque shapes. My grandfather's ghost looked at me, his expression one of deep sadness. "You can't fight them," he said, "but you can leave this place and never return." Before I could respond, the window shattered, and the cold rushed in like a tidal wave. The figures were at the door now, pounding against it with inhuman strength. I grabbed my coat and bolted for the back door, ignoring my grandfather's fading form as he whispered one last warning, "Don't look back." I ran into the storm, the wind howling like a chorus of screams. The figures pursued me, their distorted forms gliding through the snow with terrifying speed. I didn't stop, didn't dare look back, even as their voices called out to me, pleading, begging, threatening. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. When I finally reached the edge of the forest and stumbled onto the main road, a passing trucker stopped and took me to safety. The cabin burned to the ground that night, though no one could explain how the fire started. I never went back to Frostvale, but the memories haunt me still. On cold winter nights, when the wind howls and the world is blanketed in snow, I hear the whisper, "Help us," they say. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear my grandfather's voice The winter of 2014 was the coldest I'd ever experienced. I was renting a small house at the edge of Hollow Pines, a remote village nestled in the mountain. It wasn't much, just a rickety old structure with drafty windows and a fireplace that seemed more decorative than functional. But it was cheap, and I needed the solitude. I'd come to escape the chaos of the city, hoping to clear my mind and finish my novel. The snowstorm began on my second night there, a relentless blizzard that buried everything in a thick, suffocating layer of white. The power went out just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and sat by the fire, trying to shake off the unease that had been creeping over me since I arrived. There was something about this, a sense of stillness that felt unnatural. The locals had been friendly enough, but their warnings about staying indoors at night lingered in my mind. "It's not safe out there after dark," the old man at the general store had said, his weathered face grave. "You hear anything strange, you stay inside. Don't go looking." I'd laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to small-town superstition. But as the hours dragged on, a storm howled outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with a faint tapping at the window. I froze, a pen in my hand hovering above the page. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, like fingers brushing against the glass. The wind, I told myself, just the wind. But then it came again, more deliberate this, a rhythmic tap, tap, tap that sent chills down my spine. I set the pen down and stood, my heart pounding as I approached the window. The snowstorm outside was a swirling wall of white, obscuring everything beyond the glass. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a shape emerged from the storm. It was a person, or so I thought. They stood just beyond the window, their face obscured by the hood of a thick, tattered coat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. They didn't move. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window. The beam cut through the snow, landing on the figure's face, or what should have been a face. What I saw wasn't human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched taut over a gaunt, skeletal frame. Its eyes were black pits, void of any emotion, and its mouth was twisted into an unnatural grin. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. The skin of its fingers was cracked and raw, like frostbitten flesh. Then it spoke. "Let me in," it whispered, its voice a raspy, hollow echo. "It's so cold." My breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a trick of the storm and my overactive imagination. The figure began to move, circling the house with slow, deliberate steps. Its hand dragged along the walls, creating a faint scratching sound that sent shivers down my spine. I locked the doors, every window, and sat by the fire, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The scratching continued, relentless, as the figure circled again and again. "Let me in," it whispered from somewhere outside. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You can't hide," it said, its voice now right outside the front door. The doorknob rattled. I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tightly as I approached the door. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. Silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then the whisper came again, this time from inside the house. "Why won't you let me in?" I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. The figure was standing in the corner of the room, its black eyes locked on mine. It grinned, its teeth yellow and jagged. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The storm had cleared and the house was empty. But the scratches on the walls were real. I left Hollow Pines that day, abandoning everything I'd brought with me. I didn't care about the deposit or the half-finished manuscript. I just needed to get away. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. But sometimes, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls, I hear it again. "Let me in." I'll never forget the winter I spent at Blackwood Inn. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to escape the chaos of my life and focus on myself for one. The inn, an old, sprawling Victorian mansion, was tucked away in the mountain, surrounded by dense forest. The kind of place that exuded charm and history, but also felt inexplicably off. I was the only guest there. The innkeeper, a gaunt woman named Mrs. Harrow, explained that the heavy snowfall often deterred visitors this time of year. She seemed kind enough, though her pale eyes lingered on me a little too long, and her smile never quite reached her lips. "Enjoy your stay," she said, handing me an old-fashioned key. "And remember, never leave your door unlocked at night." Her words unsettled me, but I brushed them off as eccentricity. Old inns often came with quirky rules, didn't they? The first night was uneventful. I curled up in my room, a cozy space with a canopy bed and a crackling fireplace. The storm outside howled relentlessly, shaking the windows and drowning out any other sounds. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something strange. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A faint creaking, like footsteps on the floorboards outside my room. At first, I thought it was Mrs. Harrow making her rounds, but the footsteps were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth in front of my door. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no response. After a few moments, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the old wood settling or the wind playing tricks on me. I locked my door just to be safe and tried to go back to sleep, but the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They stopped directly in front of my door, and then came a sound that chilled me to the bone. The doorknob rattling. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table, clutching it tightly as I stared at the door. The rattling grew more frantic, then stopped abruptly. For a moment, silent. Then, a voice. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to seep through the very wall. "Let me in." I didn't respond. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest as the whisper came again, more insistent this. "Let me in." I backed away from the door, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where would I go? The inn was surrounded by a raging snowstorm, and I had no idea what or who was outside that door. The whisper turned into a growl, and then something scratched at the door. A horrible, clawing sound that made my skin crawl. I don't know how long it lasted. Hours. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the room fell deathly silent. The next morning, I confronted Mrs. Harrow. "Was someone outside my room last night?" I demanded. Her expression darkened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. "You didn't open the door, did you?" "Of course not," I snapped. "What's going on here?" She hesitated, then said in a low voice, "There's a reason we don't take many guests in the winter. Something roams these halls when the storms come. It's been here as long as the inn had, maybe longer." I stared at her, disbelief and anger warring with, "You should have told me." "I did," she said, her voice firm. "I told you to lock your door." That night, I locked the door again, double-checked it, and even shoved a chair under the doorknob, but it didn't matter. The footsteps came back, heavier this time, like boots thudding against the floorboard. The doorknob rattled violently, and the whisper returned, louder and more guttural than, "Let me in," it growled, its voice reverberating through the room. The walls began to shake, and the temperature plummeted until I could see my breath in the air. Shadows flickered across the room, shapes that didn't match the glow of the fireplace. And then, the door cracked. Not just the wood. The lock itself began to splinter. In a panic, I grabbed my bag and fled out the window into the storm. The cold bit at my skin, and the snow was so thick I could barely see, but I didn't care. Anything was better than staying in that room. I don't know how I made it back to the main road. When a passing car finally picked me up, I was half frozen and incoherent, rambling about whispers and shadows. I never went back to Blackwood Inn, and I heard it closed for good the following year. Sometimes I wonder if Mrs. Harrow is still there, wandering the empty halls, but on stormy winter nights, I hear it again in my dreams, the footsteps, the whispers, and that terrible guttural voice. "Let me in." The winter of 2016 was unforgiving, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. That year, I decided to spend the holidays in my late uncle's hunting cabin, deep in the woods of Snow Hollow. I thought it would be a peaceful retreat, a chance to get away from the noise of the world and focus myself. The cabin was rustic, isolated, and surrounded by miles of dense forest. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. Just me, a wood-burning stove, and the endless expanse of trees buried under snow. The first night passed uneventfully. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the only sounds were the occasional groan of the old cabin settling, the wind howling outside. But as I lay in bed, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't the isolation. I'd always enjoyed being alone. No, this was different. It was as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for me to make a wrong move. On the second night, the unease turned into something worse. I had been chopping wood earlier that afternoon, preparing for the coming storm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretched long and strained, twisting the landscape into something unrecognizable. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. The prints were large, far too big to belong to a human, and they trailed around the cabin in a wide circle before disappearing into the trees. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a bear, maybe, but the size and shape of the prints didn't match anything I'd ever seen. That night, I locked the door and bolted the windows, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as the hours dragged on, the forest grew eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling branches, no distant howls, just silence. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated through the floorboard. It was close, just outside the cabin. I grabbed the shotgun my uncle had left behind, my hands trembling as I aimed it at the door. The growling grew louder, more aggressive, and then came the sound of something heavy scratching at the wall. It circled the cabin, its claws dragging across the wood with deliberate intent. Every hair on my body stood on end as I realized this wasn't some wild animal. Whatever it was, it knew I was inside. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a voice, deep, raspy, and inhuman. "Let me in." I froze, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. The voice sounded human, but there was something wrong with it, something unnatural. "No," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." The cabin began to shake, as if some immense weight was pressing down on it. The growling returned, and the windows rattled in their frames. I backed away from the door, clutching the shotgun tightly. The fire in the hearth flickered and dimmed, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. And then I saw it. A face pressed against the window, pale and distorted, its eyes black as coal. Its mouth was wide, filled with jagged teeth, and it grinned at me with a malice that made my blood run cold. It wasn't human. I fired the shotgun, the blast shattering the window and filling the room with the acrid smell of gunpowder. When I looked again, the creature was gone, but the growling didn't stop. It was everywhere now, coming from all sides of the cabin. The walls creaked and groaned as something, or multiple something, circled the building. Desperate, I grabbed my coat and boots, throwing them on as I prepared to make a run for it. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was out there wasn't going to leave me alone. I burst out the door and into the freezing night, the snow crunching under my boots as I ran toward my truck. The storm had started, the wind whipping snow into my face and blinding me. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them. Footsteps, growls, and that awful rasping voice. "Let me in." I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys as the growling grew louder. When I finally got the door open and climbed inside, I locked it and started the engine. As the truck roared to life, I glanced in the rearview mirror. They were there, standing at the edge of the woods, pale, misshapen figures with hollow eyes and grinning mouths. They watched as I sped away, their forms disappearing into the blizzard. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I never went back to the cabin, never told anyone what happened that. But sometimes, when I'm alone on a cold winter night, I hear it again, that voice faint and distant. "Let me in." The snowstorm hit early that year. It came without warning, thick, blinding flakes that seemed to appear out of nowhere and immediately enveloped everything. The weather reports had predicted a light dusting, but the mountains had their own plan. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make my way back home through the winding roads of Frostpine, a small town nestled in the hills where I had grown up. I hadn't been back in years. I was just passing through, hoping to get through the storm and make it to the next town for shelter. But as the storm worsened, the visibility became nearly impossible. The roads were slippery, the snow accumulating faster than the plows could keep up. It was then that I saw it, a sign half buried in the snow. The letters were faded and barely readable, but I made out enough to know that it was pointing toward a bed and breakfast. "The last stop," it said. Just the kind of place you'd expect to find on these lonely mountain roads, offering warmth and respite from the storm. I turned onto the narrow, snow-covered lane, hoping it would be the relief I needed. As I drove down the twisting path, the storm seemed to grow even more intense, the wind howling and the snow swirling in thick, dizzying spiral. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw it. The bed and breakfast. It was an old, crumbling Victorian house, its windows dark and still. The porch sagged, and the door hung ajar, creaking with each gust of wind. I didn't hesitate. I pulled up in front, relieved to have found a place. When I walked inside, the warmth of the air hit me like a wave. The fire in the hearth crackled. A faint scent of cedarwood lingered in it. It was charming, though the decor was outdated and a little too eerie for comfort. Old portraits hanging on the walls, thick velvet curtains that didn't seem to move, no matter how much the wind outside howled. An old woman appeared from the shadows, her face wrinkled but still sharp with tensity that made me pause. "Welcome," she said softly, her voice crackling with age. "I'm Eleanor. You must be the last guest before the storm locks us in." I nodded, exhausted from the long drive. "I'm just passing through. The storm's pretty bad." "It is," she agreed, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. "But you're safe here now. Stay for the night, and in the morning, the storm will pass. Or you can leave if you prefer." Something about her tone made... "I think I'll stay," I said, brushing aside the odd feeling. It was just the storm playing tricks on me, making my imagination run wild. Eleanor led me up a narrow staircase to a room at the end of the hall. The door creaked as she opened, revealing a bed covered in an old quilt, the sheets neatly folded. There was a large window, but the snowstorm had obscured everything beyond it. "Rest here," Eleanor said. "Everything you need is in the room. If you need anything, just ask." I thanked her and she left, closing the door quietly behind her. The room was quiet, too quiet. I pulled the quilt up and tried to sleep, but there was something off about the air felt stale, as if it had been undisturbed for far too long. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch me, their eyes tracking my every movement. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a soft thud coming from somewhere downstairs. I sat up, straining to listen. Another thud. I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me. I slipped out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and tiptoed to the door. I opened it cautiously and peeked out into the dark hallway. The house was eerily still. I looked down the stairs and saw nothing. But then, I heard it again. A soft, shuffling sound coming from below. Against my better judgment, I crept down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got to the source of the noise, the more I could feel a presence, something that wasn't right. I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned the corner into the dimly lit hallway. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, the faint sound of scraping coming from within. I shouldn't have gone down there. But my legs moved on their own. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling, and pulled it open. The basement was cold, far colder than the rest of the house. The air smelled of rot, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift. I took a step down the creaky wooden stairs, and then I saw it. A figure standing in the corner, its back to me. It was a man, no, person, dressed in old, tattered clothes, his body hunched and twisted in unnatural angles. His face was hidden in shadow, but the faint glow from the single light bulb hanging above illuminated his thin, skeletal hands. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure turned slowly, deliberately, and I saw its face. It was Eleanor, but it wasn't Eleanor. Her face was pale and gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her skull, and her eyes, those eyes, were black as coal, empty and hollow. She grinned at me, showing teeth that were far too sharp for a human. "Leave while you still can," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't wait for her to say anything more. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, out the door, and into the storm. The wind whipped against my face as I ran blindly through the snow, not caring where I went. When I looked back, the house was gone. There was nothing but the howling wind and the endless white of storm. I never made it out of Frostpine. The authorities said I was lost in the storm, that they never found my body, but I know the truth. The last stop had never been meant for me. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a few days to escape the stress of my job and reconnect with some old friends. We rented a cabin tucked away in a secluded valley where the roads were barely passable in the winter. I thought the isolation would be peaceful, quiet, perfect. The cabin itself looked like something from a postcard, quaint with its wooden beams and stone fireplace. Inside, it was cozy, the kind of place that made you want to curl up with a good book. It was the perfect retreat. At least, that's what we thought. There were 5 of us, me, 2 college friends, and a couple we hadn't seen in years. We all had our reasons for wanting to leave the city behind for a few days. The first night was filled with laughter, wine, and old memory. But as the night went on, the conversation started to shift. It began with a story. One of the guys, Jared, had always been into the paranormal, always pushing the limits of what we considered real. He mentioned something about an old local legend, a tale about a creature that roamed the woods around the cabin. The story was vague, something about a shadow that stalked those who dared enter the forest after dark, a spirit that could shapeshift into anything it desired. It was an old folk tale, but for some reason, it sent a chill down my... Nothing more than a campfire, I said, trying to laugh it off. But Jared's face was serious. I'm telling you, there's something out there, something that watches, waits, and if you're not careful, it might take you. We all laughed nervously, brushing off the conversation as nothing more than idle chatter. The storm outside had picked up, and we retreated to our rooms for the night. That's when the first odd thing happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. The wind was howling outside, the snow piling up against the windows. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place, except for the fact that the door to my room was wide open. I hadn't opened it. I walked over and closed it, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But then I noticed something strange, the cold. The room felt colder than it had before, as though something was standing right outside the door, just beyond the reach of the warmth of the fireplace. I stood there for a moment, listening. A faint scratching. It was coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew more deliberate, more rhythmic. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my phone to check the time, but when I turned on the flashlight, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A set of muddy footprints leading from my door to the window. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing as I rushed over to the window and peered out into the darkness. But there was nothing. Just snow swirling in the wind. No movement, no figure lurking in the night. I told myself it was nothing. The storm must have caused the weird draft, the scratching everything. But when I turned to leave the window, I saw something in the reflection. A shadow. It was barely there, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. But it was unmistakable. A tall, hunched figure, moving swiftly across the snow, disappearing into the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed, unsure if I had imagined. It wasn't until I heard the creak of the door that I snapped back to reality. I ran out into the hallway, but when I reached the living room, no one else was awake. I felt alone. I checked on the others, but they were sound asleep, undisturbed by the unsettling events. I considered waking them, telling them what I'd seen, but I didn't. They'd think I was just spooked by the storm. So I went back to my room, locked the door, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had been imagining, but the unease didn't go away. It clung to me like a second skin. Later that afternoon, we decided to go for a walk in the woods. I wasn't thrilled about it, especially after the strange occurrences the night before. But it was Jared's idea. He wanted to prove that the story of the creature was just that, a story. We walked through the snow, the silence of the forest pressing in on us. The trees were bare, their branches heavy with snow, and the only sounds were crunch of our boots in the snow and the occasional howl of the wind. Then, we came across something that stopped us all in our tracks. A large, twisted tree stood in the middle of the clearing, its bark blackened as though it had been scorched by fire. Around its base were deep scratches, claw marks that dug into the earth, leaving grooves in the snow. The air was colder here, the wind cutting through the branches with a sharpness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "That's not normal," Jared said, his voice faltering. I stepped closer, examining the marks. They were too deep to be from any animal, too deliberate, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl. It was so close that it rattled my bones. We froze, our eyes scanning the woods around us, but there was nothing. No creature, no shadow, nothing to explain the sound. I turned to say something to the group, but my words died in my throat when I saw it. Movement in the trees, something tall and dark, standing just out of sight. Before I could say anything, the growl came again, closer this time, and then we all heard it, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the snow, its steps heavy and deliberate. We ran. We didn't stop until we were back at the cabin, but when we got inside, we realized something that made my blood run cold. The footprints in the snow outside weren't ours. That night, we barricaded the doors and windows, but I could still hear it, scratching at the walls, pacing around the cabin. Something was out there, watching us, waiting, and by the time the storm finally cleared, there was no trace of the creature, no sign of the strange footprints or the growls, just the snow, deep and untouched, as though nothing had happened at all. We left the cabin the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that whatever we had encountered in those woods had followed us home. I haven't been able to sleep properly since, and I can still hear the scratching sometimes late at night, just outside my window. It never stops.